Okay, so in the last session, we talked about, uh, you know, the again in review of the first Chinese characters of the Daoism in the opening of the book. We talked about this universal laws cannot be reduced to the specific thing, uh, the rules that for the technical scope. Um, I'm going to go a little bit further into that. Um, Back on the calligraphy, which both for Chinese and Japanese, it was calligraphy of Chinese characters, same Chinese characters. But the Japanese call it, use the word Dao, which is, Daoism, Dao, right? But the Chinese never use Dao for calligraphy. Chinese use the word Fa. What is Fa? There are at least two meanings of this Chinese character. One is the methodology. The other is actually copy. Okay, you start in Chinese way of learning. A lot of it, you start by copying the masters, and while you do copy, you don't just copy paste, copy paste. No, you try to figure out where is the better part and try to get there. So that's for Chinese. That's calligraphy. I guess practice a methodology because we never ever claim to be, oh, we're the best or even we're good. For old school Chinese or Chinaman, you typically when say people say, oh, you're so good at this and that, you always say almost 100%, 10 out of 10, you say, oh, I'm still trying. I'm still trying. Why? You don't really know who's better, and you would make a full lot of yourself, basically. So back to the calligraphy and the ink brush painting, right? You practice. And if at the meantime you also study, I'm talking about the self improving and purifying study, then your state of mind begin to, I guess, transform in the process of all this practice of music making, calligraphy, landscaping, not landscape, well, actually landscaping, and the landscape genre, ink brush painting. You practice all this, right? This is the, means to get to the end, right? But then, what do you think would help you to get to the better, and better and better when you practice all this? There's a word for this. It's a French word, and I don't speak French, so I'm gonna pronounce as American. Connoisseur, right? That back then in the old Chinese, I guess the ancient Chinese society, a connoisseur was the, I guess, hard to come by status within the circle, the inner circle of the Chinese elites, because you can get promoted, get to a certain court rank, or you can, be a very prolific artist of either calligraphy or ink brush painting or even both. Very rarely, but all the Chinese elites back then, they all could do all this, but you get to be the best of your own times in both genre. um I cannot really think of too many. There were a few, right? But let's just say you are actually, achieving that kind of recognition within the circle of the Chinese elites with your works. And still, who would be the most appreciated, uh, you know, Chinese elite inner circle, the ones that were considered connoisseur. Because remember, this is the time tracing back to almost 1,000 years ago. There was no such a thing as a public museum, not in ancient China. So with all those masterpieces of artworks, where did they go, right? So who got their hands on them? Apparently, some people, uh, had their way to get their hands on those and became the collectors. But just because you are a collector does not mean necessarily you are a really, established and recognized connoisseur. Why is that? I mean, if you by chance, got hold of a few masterpieces for whatever reason, and that stayed in your household, and somehow you manage the financial resource to even go out and collect even more, right? That you go after. But then here's the thing: you have a few, or even a pile, in a small house, just designed and built just for that collection purpose. You've got them. But first, when you were in the process of acquiring them, how did you know that was authentic? One. And then a great work. Two. And then a masterpiece. Three. How can you tell? You may have the means to get to the possession of those, but in the acquisition, you don't even know, right? So this is where the collectors would have to go to those recognized, established connoisseurs. Those were the guys who tell you, yeah, this looked like authentic. Yeah, I would really, really believe that this one is more like the real thing than not. So now we're talking about the people who are in the position to tell the difference. And in the Chinese ancient culture, which is still, I believe, exists today, if you paid big bucks for something that is really just a fake, people laugh at you, not in your face, but behind you. You would probably hear the giggling behind your back. And that's a shame, big shame. You don't even want to talk about it, okay? So in that culture, it's not like, oh, we protect the consumers and you were selling fake. No. In ancient Chinese culture, they can sell whatever they want. It's up to you to decide, are you buying the real thing? Do you even know the difference? If you let people know in the market that you don't even know the difference, the joke is on you. That was the culture, right? So to be a great, through the Ming Empire and the Manchurian Empire, basically those established connoisseurs, they meet certain criteria. One, they practice the arts themselves, so they know the techniques. And because remember, they all started by copying. Remember, at the beginning I said the fa. That's the Chinese character. Both means methodology and it means copy. They started by copying the masterpieces, and to not just copy one, two, or three, all the famous ones. So they were introduced to all those styles, artistic styles, the artistic language, before they emerged with their own. They created their own style, right? So in those cases, a lot of those connoisseurs, they were very famous artists themselves, on the top in the nation. And then because, a lot of people ask for their opinion, they present the collected pieces. So they got exposure to a whole lot more artworks than all the other average artists of their times. That's one type of connoisseur. But then there were other types. Now this start to get a little more interesting. This other type, typically they have been at least 3, 5, 7, or even more generations of the credentialed royal court uh, officials or the Chinese elite for many generations, the Chinese gentlemen. So if you were already a gentleman and you are practicing the arts yourself, of course you appreciate other arts. Like I mentioned earlier, the way the Chinese elite arts circulated were entirely different from in the West, because this was basically created by and for the Chinese elites. So if you're in the circle, yes, you get your hands on some of the great pieces, right? And so if you come from a household, through generations, there were many, many court officials, and their collections do add up, right? So when you were born into this household, you were exposed to a lot of great, masterpieces because of the family collection, right? So your taste obviously will be different from those just, first generation Chinese gentlemen just passed their 3-level exams. They're just on their way in, not even exactly on their way up yet, right? They're yet to learn a lot of things for the inner circle, entrance. As versus those guys, their father, grandfather, great grandfather, great 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 grandfather, they were all royal officials, royal court officials of different empires coming through. Think about that kind of exposure, that kind of upbringing, right? So this sort of connoisseur, they're typically not necessarily a good or great artist themselves. Of course, they can do a thing too, but they rob with the exposure. They have this knowledge, okay? So they acquired all that. What I am actually getting into is not really about all this. It's about the story behind the story. What is that? Now I'm going to put a stop on the Chinese part. Let's go back to the Western. At one time, from time to time, I go around those regional antique shows. So at one of them, I passed by a booth, and then I thought I saw something in the corner of my eyes. It was a quick glimpse. So I backed up several steps, and then bent over and looked down. I saw one sketch. It was very, very talented. Being an artist, myself, obviously I could tell, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Whose sketch was this? Apparently, I'm not so intimately acquainted with all the sketches by all the greatest artists of all times from all countries, right? So I wasn't sure. So while I was studying that sketch, the dealer of that booth came to me, said, "Are you interested in this, sir?" I said, "Well, I know this must be from some great artist. I just can't put my finger on whose work was this. It's kind of intriguing." So the dealer said, "Well, sir, I'll be honest with you. I know whose this is, but I just couldn't, prove, and that's why I'm selling it." So I'm like, okay, now we're onto something. So tell me the story about it. So the guy said, of course, Thomas, Atkins, right? Of course I do. That's one of the, top few American artists of that time that I really appreciate. Whenever I go to American art museums, that's one of the guys, I would have to go to see, what collections this particular art museum, has in their household. Basically, for me, if you don't have any, I don't think I'll come back next time. You got to have something. I don't know if I should say, well, I'm just going to ahead and say, in Dallas, there's a very nice looking art museum. What do they have there in collection? Nothing worth it for me to make a next, trip. But anyway, back to this point, that the guy was sharing a story with me about this. He said, it's very, very clearly to me that it is a work by Thomas Eakins. And I looked at it. Yeah, now that you say that, yeah, it does look just like his works. In the back of my mind, something I scanned like a radar. What I read or scanned before, and I'm like, can you hold on this for me? I will come back next day. And the guy said, of course, everybody does that, sure. But he said, you have to put on, some deposit there. And then I was thinking, okay, I put the deposit there and then I have to drive back for, I believe, a few hundred miles. Another round trip. Is it worth it? I said, okay, tell me how much you want for this. Could it be fake? Of course, there's a chance. But then the guy said, well, sounds like you know this sort of things and probably know the market too. So I won't waste your time. I'll just tell you, if you give me $1,500, I'll let you take it away. Okay? Deposit, you would have to put $1,000. I'm like, okay, I'll just risk it. So I brought it home. And then, of course, I got the books at home. I got a lot of art history books. So I started to compare. The more I look at it, the more I became convinced that this was, a sketch by Thomas Eakins. So I contact the expert back then of entire United States, the expert on Thomas Eakins. I don't know if I want to give her name. I'm not even sure she's still around, but she was the chair of the American Art Center at the Art Museum of Philadelphia, which was a institution collect I'm talking about all artworks, great pieces by Thomas Eakins. Why? Because Thomas Eakins basically came out of there, professionally grew up there, and taught there. So basically, that was Thomas Eakins' home. And this museum, old art museum, they gotta have certain, curating strategy and direction. So for Philadelphia Art Museum, basically they put the emphasis on the collection of Thomas Eakins. So a few years before I got my hand on this sketch, I knew Philadelphia Art Museum actually raised a fund of 67 million US dollars on one oil painting, came to the market that was by Thomas Eakins. Of course, I wasn't thinking about money. I just wanted to make sure this was the, the artwork of the, a master. So I made an appointment with a lady, and she was the authority, still alive at the time, on Thomas Eakins. So I flew to see her. And she said, whoa, you came all the way from Houston to Philadelphia just for this? I said, yeah, think about that. How excited I am to see you. So I showed her the sketch, and she took me to the studio, and there were 5 of them on display, not in the public gallery, but in a kind of studio. So we kind of analyzed the sketch that I presented. We analyzed together. We went over and talked about this and that. it was a great time I had with her, in her studio. And she said, well, Mr. Lee, I can only tell you this looks like something I would attribute to Thomas Akins. But, there's always a but, you don't have the story to back it up. I said, yeah, that's exactly why I got my hands on it, and the dealer sold it to me because he didn't have the story. And then the lady told me, you see, with Thomas Akins, the thing is, the whole thing was in the hold of his survived wife, who eventually gave it away in a couple of patches. So I mean batches. So everything had a story, right? And this several batches ended up in exactly where and how they come about and found their way to the museum's collection. And yours? What's your story? I said, well, my dealer told me he got it from a private auction outside Boston, except for he couldn't tell me any more specific. If he did, I'm not sure he would sell it to me anyway. So he didn't have the whole story that actually could explain. Because the lady told me it's very unlikely there's some, I guess pieces, just fell out of the patches on their way to whoever, was collecting. And nevertheless, out, kind of under the radar from our museum, that we never even heard of that. But then in the meantime, does it look like his work? Absolutely. But do you think people would want to copy a sketch rather than a, let's say, oil canvas that you can sell for big money? That's a question. But nevertheless, she said, that's why I would attribute this sketch to Thomas Akins. I cannot tell you this is or was. Now, the story of the story, the virtue of this story, it's not even about the collection. And then we now go back to the Chinese collections, right? So there were some very, very famous collectors at the end of Ming Empire, at the beginning of the Manchurian Empire. So basically, how did they get their hands on it? Of course, they all grew up with the family collections, came through generations, but that wasn't it. The reason they became the biggest collector was when the Ming Empire was falling apart. A lot of art collections, the royal collections, just basically started to come out of the royal palace, sold by those, I guess whoever was, or they were working inside the royal palace, and they came out as very, very good price for the collectors, because at the time of war chaos, a lot of people did not even know where they're going to get their next meal. So who has the extra money to buy those things? And why do you think they even sell those things? Because a lot of people just basically could not, I guess, pass a day with some meal. So what do? They start selling those things. Some they find their way to get their hands on the royal collections from inside the royal palace. So the collector, at least one of the collectors, his whole point was not to add it on to his own collection, which was getting just simply, growing bigger and bigger and too big. But he didn't want to have all this masterpiece just, basically either damaged, destroyed, or just went nowhere. So he was basically collecting for that purpose. And of course, he got a good price and everything. But then this story, right? And that story, my own story, that my own experience, went to Philadelphia Art Museum. What does that tell me, right? It tells me all this, so, valuable great uh, artwork, masterpieces, they pretty much just basically go, through all the different households. When you rose up in social rank and economic, status with your deeper pocket, you can get your hands on a lot of nice things. But then, hey, uh, in Chinese, they say it takes 3 generations to grow into a proper taste, that sort. And then also they also said it's very difficult, passing beyond 3 generations. Your household still stay, up, not on your way down. So nevertheless, basically the antiques, the masterpieces, from the ancient times came into appreciation by the household who were on their way up, and then they were on their way down. So this just basically all this antiques just came into such household, and then found their way to the next household, and then the next, and the next, and next. They were just basically drifting through, just like people, drift through your life on this planet. The antique, the greatest art piece, same thing. Okay, so when you are standing in a Chinese art museum, you're looking at a one masterpiece. What you don't know is, where did that come from? Where were they? How many, very, very famous household of the times they came through? Oh, that story. Actually, for me, that's a very intriguing. As much as I appreciate the great art, those stories were even more interesting and more intriguing, because you would hear a lot of stories like that, right? I remember first time I went to Chicago, the local tour told a story which stayed here with me all this time. The story went like this. Okay, a sales guy wanted to have an appointment with, I won't name the name, but a very big American chain store, retail, and this was the time more than 100 years ago. So the sales wanted to see this new shiny new penny, the new rich of America of the year, probably. Said, sir, I only need 5 minutes of your time. And the guy said, yeah, okay, I'm looking at the clock. Shoot. So the sales guy said, sir, have you heard of this name? Blah, blah, blah. Mm-mm. Have you heard of that name? Mm-mm. What about this? Mm-mm. What about that? Mm-mm. So a couple of names started, and then a couple more followed. And then the sales guy was telling the new shining penny of America, sir, all those names, they were the top richest people in this country. Apparently you have never heard of them. And the guy, oh, should I? Yeah, well, who knows? The point I'm making here, sir, is, do you want to be remembered as someone actually contributed? Oh, so what are you getting at? I think I see where this is going. You wanted me to make checks for you, right? Sir, no, let me correct you. Allow me. You're not writing a check for me. You're writing a check for a museum in Chicago, okay? So this museum will be named after you. So for generations and generations, the people around Chicago come to this museum, they will remember you. Unlike those big names, one time they were around, but nobody, like such as yourself, even heard of them. The guy got a big check, big fat check, right? So all this story put together, nothing stays the same forever. That's why we have the antique, okay? That's why we have the connoisseur of certain time, and then that connoisseur will be gone, right? So we do what we do, but You want to hold on to it indefinitely? Daydream, baby. Daydream. Until next time, ciao.